Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 121 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I've got an article that I'd like to share with you from the Mises Institute website. Uh, it's a Mises Wire article by Finn Andreen, and the article is called "The Danger of the West's Neglect of Individual Rights." As you know, I've talked about individual rights on a number of occasions on this podcast. And I think that so much of what we hear about in politics and what the government should do about this or that issue that's facing society or that's problematic is that most of the discussion neglects or is based on a lack of understanding about individual rights and where rights come from. And so that's why I tend to come back to this issue again and again, is because it should be the focus of most of the discussion, most of the public discourse about what the government should or should not do, and in most cases what the government should not do. And so this article I thought was worthwhile to share. And as always, I like to give more attention to the Mises Institute. I think they are one of the most consistent organizations in providing commentary on individual liberty, on economics, and other topics um, in the news and in society. So, once again, this article is "The Danger of the West's Neglect of Individual Rights." And before I share the article, I want to share a quote with you. And this is a quote by Frederick Bastiat. And he says, "We disapprove of state education. Then the socialists say that we are opposed to any education. We object to a state religion. Then the socialists say that we want no religion at all. We object to state enforced equality. Then they say that we are against equality," and so on and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat because we do not want the state to raise grain. And again, that's a quote by Frederick Bastiat, and it points out that just because we are opposed to the state producing this or that thing, generally everything, unless you take a minimal state view of the world where the government should be providing only courts to resolve disputes, police to enforce the law, and a minimal military for the limited purpose of defense, not foreign adventurism, which, of course, the United States has been engaged in for nearly a century. So I think that quote is very sort of it drives home that point that just because we don't want the state to provide education doesn't mean we're against education. It means exactly the opposite. The most important things, food, education, healthcare, are things that we should not want provided by the government because it is the worst at efficiently allocating those resources. So with that, let's get into the article for today, "The Danger of the West's Neglect of Individual Rights," by Finn Andreen, and that's Finn, Finn, Andreen, Andreen. He says, "Though the Western political class constantly criticizes the authoritarian nature of certain nations, one should sweep in front of his own door first." To paraphrase Johann von Goethe, indeed, Western nations, or rather Western nation states and international institutions have for years been gnawing at the freedom and rights of both individuals and businesses. First, the exorbitant fiscal and inflationary pressures on Western populations should never be considered normal or acceptable. They are severe violations of property rights in and of themselves. These pressures alone help to explain the economic stagnation and political decadence of Western societies. Additionally, previously unthinkable powers have been given to Western police and security forces, many of them now permanent. WikiLeaks and others have revealed the programs of mass surveillance of entire populations that are practiced by unaccountable Western intelligence agencies. Censorship and propaganda are common practices by governments and mainstream media, not least in Western democracies where control of public opinion is key. But the violation of rights in the West took a dramatic turn when the unprecedented and unjustified confinements of healthy people during the COVID-19 pandemic, essentially mandatory vaccination policies, and the other political scandals surrounding these vaccines. Next on the agenda are further restrictions to the freedom of speech on certain social media platforms. New laws like the Restrict Act, restricting the emergence of security threats that risk information and communications technology in the United States, and the Digital Services Act in Europe are undemocratically pushed through, ostensibly to protect the people. However, they allow the Western oligarchic elite to increase its control over society, implement its globalist agenda, and protect itself from brewing dissent. Yet in the near future, things are probably going to get far worse. From the alarming potential control of individual lives through the planned digital wallets and central bank digital currencies to grave economic and social consequences of the Green Deals, all the alarm bells have been ringing for some time already. In view of these severe rights violations and threats of further violations, much more pushback from the majority at the receiving end might be expected. True, there are pockets of political disobedience, like the encouraging farmers' protests in Europe, but these are fringe movements by people who are experiencing firsthand the above-mentioned policies. These are positive signs of disapproval among the general population, like a measurable loss of trust in both Western mainstream media and political leaders. Yet there is no massive opposition to these glaring violations of individual rights. Thus, before asking what conditions are needed for radical political change in the West, it seems necessary to first look at this indifference. The neglect of individual rights. The Western world was able to produce such inspiring texts as the French Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen and the U.S. Bill of Rights, both from 1789. Their purpose was to guarantee the protection of individual rights and liberty against state coercion. For more than 2 centuries, these two documents have played a certain role in restraining the most egregious violations of individual rights by Western governments against their subjects. It must be noted, however, that these documents have not only been quite liberally interpreted, but also violated, even openly, on many occasions. For example, forced conscription and confiscatory taxation, to name but 2. This is unavoidable when such rights are only protected by the willingness of legislators and judges to adhere to old parchments, however sacred they are often pretended to be. Considering the relatively poor protection of individual rights that these documents have in fact provided, it is not surprising that these rights, in particular, the most fundamental one, the right to property, can be so easily undermined today. Arguably, this current brazen violation of rights can happen for several reasons. First, in the prevailing postmodernist culture, the meanings of words are subjective, positivist, and not to be taken very seriously. This is reflected in the current zeitgeist, which considers statist intervention as not only acceptable, but also a much better means to move society than such quaint old principles. A good example of this is the draconian measures that are planned to be imposed in order to fight climate change. Second, individual rights are usually disregarded by the majority because they are taken for granted. This is the naive end of history conviction. according to which Western liberal democracies are the pinnacle of mankind's moral and political development. It is the idea, common among the good-hearted but politically ignorant, that individual rights no longer need attention because they have been acquired already, once and for all. There is thus little recognition today in the West that the struggle for liberty never ends. As Benjamin Constant said in a famous speech to the French Assembly in 1819, in order to benefit from the liberty that they would like, the people must exercise an active and constant surveillance of their representatives. Otherwise, as George Santayana wrote, unless all those concerned keep a vigilant eye on the course of public business and frequently pronounce on its conduct, they will before long awake to the fact that they have been ignored and enslaved. Such words of wisdom have never been absorbed by Western publics. The focus on positive rights. The third way in which individual rights are undermined is when they are interpreted too widely and thus diluted. This happens when rights are expanded to include not only negative rights, but also positive ones, those that the state is expected to enforce. This legitimizes both the state's growth as well as its coercive and unjust wealth redistribution in order to assure equality of opportunity, or worse, equality of outcome. Such thinking permeates Western society, even in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which hails positive rights, such as the right to work, the right to equal pay, or the right to rest and leisure. These are obviously not rights in the same sense as the natural right to property, and their enforcement by the state necessarily violates the property rights of others. Indeed, as Murray Rothbard wrote in The Ethics of Liberty, the very concept of rights is a negative one, demarcating the areas of a person's action that no man may properly interfere with. As ever, education and liberty. There can be only one result of this multifaceted neglect of individual rights among the majority in the West, the creeping violation of individual rights that is so obvious today. If the principles of natural rights were really taught, instead of the vacuous mantra repeated ad nauseum that all men are created equal, then the nefarious agenda of control being imposed by the Western ruling minority would be far more readily resisted. It is worth remembering that the first sentence of the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen states, ignorance, forgetfulness, or contempt for human rights are the only causes of public misfortunes and government corruption. Efforts must therefore continue unabated to inform and educate the public about the principles of freedom and the importance of protecting negative rights against constant attempts to violate them. So that's the end of the article there by Finn Andreen. Again, the article called "The Danger of the West's Neglect of Individual Rights." As always, I will link to the article in the show notes. But I like the points he makes here. He talks about the ideals that are set out by these old parchments, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Bill of Rights and so on. But they are just that. They're just parchment barriers. They're not, unless the populace, unless the public enforces them, has expectations of their governments to follow them, the governments will inevitably, the politicians and the government will inevitably overstep the bounds and the limitations that are set out by these documents. And so there has to be a willingness, a desire by the people, by individuals like you and me, to enforce, to limit the government within the bounds of these documents. Otherwise, they are just that, parchment barriers with no power in their own right. And so it's up to you and me. Liberty dies with apathy. It's up to us to maintain freedom, to get freedom back where it's already been lost. And just as the article says, near the end, it says, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen states, ignorance, forgetfulness, or contempt for human rights are the only causes of public misfortunes and government corruption. We have ignored, forgotten, and developed contempt within the public for negative rights. And that's why we've begotten more misfortune and more government corruption, because we've allowed it to happen. We've ignored the principles and the ideals contained within the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We've forgotten the tyranny of the government of the king that we separated from. And we've developed contempt for the rights of others in the name of equity, in the name of equality of outcome. We need to refocus on negative rights rather than positive ones. Positive ones, while they sound good because it has positive in the name, are actually not rights at all, because they create a duty on someone else. We need to focus on negative rights and enforcing those. I'll link to the show that I did about negative and positive rights. I think that people need to keep that in mind and keep going back to that notion when they think about problems in society, and how the proposed solutions are really about enforcing positive rights rather than negative rights. All right, well, that's where I'll leave it for this episode. I want to share just one more time this quote from Frederick Bastiat, because it's related to this article. He says, "We disapprove of state education. Then the socialists say that we are opposed to any education. We object to a state religion. Then the socialists say that we want no religion at all. We object to a state-enforced equality. Then they say that we are against equality," and so on and so on. It is as if the socialists were to accuse us of not wanting persons to eat because we do not want the state to raise grain. And there's no more better example of the danger of the state controlling these things than, looking at the Soviet Union and the famine that occurred in Ukraine, the Holodomor, looking at China and the Great Leap Forward, and the millions of people who starved to death because the state took over the production of food. For all of the same reasons we don't want the government to produce our food, we also don't want them to dictate or allocate resources for healthcare, for education, for religion, for equality, and so on. I know I've mentioned the 10th Amendment Center previously as well. They are an excellent resource, and they talk a lot about this notion that the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that these documents are just parchment barriers unless the people, the public, individuals like you and me are willing to enforce them. And it's not 9 black robes at the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. that are our last hope. It's you. It's me. It's a willing and engaged populace. And they posted, the 10th Amendment Center posted on Twitter earlier this week, they said, the same government that claims it's protecting you from surveillance by prohibiting TikTok not only just gave you the biggest expansion of warrantless surveillance since the Patriot Act, which I talked about, the FISA 702, but also wants to throw developers who build privacy tools for financial transactions in jail. And they're talking about an organization that was involved in Bitcoin wallets, cryptocurrency wallets, being jailed because people use their product unlawfully. Not because the product was nefarious, but because people use their product for nefarious purposes. And so here's the government that it's not about protecting individual rights, it's about control. And that's what the government has developed into. It's an entity that's more about control than it is about protecting negative rights. And so it's our obligation, your obligation, my obligation, to be the forge of freedom, to fight for freedom, to get it back, and to keep what we have for the future. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the episodes on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and all the most popular podcast streaming platforms. This episode's coming out on Saturday. I will likely start releasing episodes on Mondays and Saturdays. I've been trying to release episodes on Fridays, but that's just not been achievable some weeks. So in the future, keep an eye out for those episodes coming out on Monday with Monday Gun Day, and Saturday, which is a more broadly freedom-related episode. Next Saturday, I'll be releasing an episode with Michael Rechtenwald, who is a candidate for president. He's running a libertarian candidate for president, and I'll be talking to him. I think you'll enjoy that discussion. He's actually a former socialist with Marxist sort of tendencies, and talk about his conversion to freedom, and also the platform that he's running on for libertarian candidate for president. So keep an eye out for that. I think you'll enjoy that discussion. Monday, for Monday Gun Day, I'll be talking about the Freeman receiver case that the United States Supreme Court has accepted for review. Of course, the Supreme Court has accepted quite a few firearms-related cases, Second Amendment-related cases, and I'm going to talk about the most recent case that was accepted by the Supreme Court, so keep an eye out for that as well. And of course, as always, until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter @ForgeOfFreedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.